Hello and welcome to another session on Sqoop. So this is the last query that we have executed where we are trying to import the data from the customers table into this particular location. Now here if you see we have just one mapper, so this basically means that there will be only one process, one single thread which is going to do all the tasks. Now there is no parallelism here. We can divide this, like let's say if I keep it as 2, what it will do is it is going to create two separate process, and it is going to separate process, two separate threads, so they are going to work together. So basically it's like you dividing that entire work among two different mappers, which is going to increase your execution speed. So let me change this. Now when you increase the number of mappers, you basically saying that, hey, here's the data that is there in the table customers. Now you have to split this data among yourselves. Like there are two mappers, so mapper 1 might take this much amount of data, the other data mapper 2 will take. So how does they do the split, right? So that is something that we have to mention here. We have to use something called a split by. And how do they split by? Usually we specify a primary key column. So here we will say customer ID. So we are saying, hey, go ahead and split the data among yourself using the customer ID, whatever the data. So maybe customer ID number 1 will go to map 1, 2 will go to map 3, it can go like this. So let me go ahead and execute this. Now another thing to remember, or another thing that I wanted to point out is, suppose if you have a primary key column in the mapping in the MySQL table, the original table, by default if you don't specify the split by, it is going to take the primary key column. So here in our case we don't have to even mention the split by column, because it will by default is going to take the customer ID. And if you do not specify the number of mappers, by default it is going to pick 4. So if you don't specify -m option, it will going to take 4. If you don't specify split by option, it is going to take the primary key column. But it is a good practice to mention explicitly the number of mappers, the split by column, so it's easy for other people to read your code, right? So that's very important. Even though it has its default values, it is always advisable to use explicitly mention this, right? Alright, so the command is now executed. So let's go ahead and check this data. Now we have mentioned mappers as 2, so you should see 2 different files that are getting created. So you can see here there are 2 files that got created. This is file number 1, file number 2. Basically that is because we have set 2 mappers, so in parallel 2 different queries would have executed, and then those queries would have took the data and in parallel created the files. So let's look at the log. So this is a log that got generated. So if you see here, right, this is something like min or max, right? So basically from the customer ID, it is taking the minimum customer ID to the maximum customer ID, and then using this it is splitting this data into 2 mappers. So you can see is the number of mappers 2. So 1 2 from 1 to 1 2 4 3 5, this much data is getting split into both these mappers. So that is how the split happens here. Now we have also mentioned that when you execute this query without the mappers and without the split by column, by default it will take the number of mappers as 4, and it is going to split based on the primary key column. So let's test that theory. So I have removed the number of mappers. I have also removed the split by option, and we are again using the delete target directory. So expectation is that the command will execute successfully, the target directory files will be deleted, and then new data will be inserted or new files will be created under the same directory. Because this customers table will have a primary key which is customer underscore ID, split will happen on customer underscore ID, and then the number of mappers by default will be 4. So you should see 4 files present in the directory. All right, the command is now executed. So let's check this log here. So somewhere here, yeah, you can see here, right, how it is splitting. It's using the minimum and maximum of customer ID. That is because it's the primary key column in the table. So it is taking that primary key column to split this data. And the number of splits is 4. Basically, that's the default number of mappers that will turn up. So let's go and check this data. So we have 4 different files. So because by default 4 mappers have executed, so this is expected, right? As we mentioned, when if you don't specify the number of mappers, by default it is going to pick 4. So basically 4 different processes are running at the same time, and then it has split the data among itself and it has created its own file. So the more number of mappers that you have, the number of parallelism will be more, and therefore your job will be that much faster. Again, it will only make sense if you have huge humongous amount of data. Now the question is like, how many number of mappers can we go, right? So that's always a big question. Can we go for 20, 30? So basically your map, when you take the number of mappers, it's, if you place one mapper, it's basically one connection or one call to your database. Now if your database is getting called from everywhere else, then it may not have that sufficient calls, it may not have that resources to allocate to you, right? So in that case, if you go, let's say your database has 64 resources that you can call like at a time, right? So there are some jobs outside your project calling the same database, and right now around 60 calls have already been in progress. So now even though you give 8, you cannot utilize 8 because there are only 4 left. So that's something that you have to keep in mind. It's not just your job that runs, it's so many other people's job that runs, and therefore you have to be very clear how many calls that you can make. And again, this is something generally we go for 4, but then if it depends, again it depends upon a lot of factors. As I mentioned, if you have a lot of calls available, why not utilize it, right? So that's one of the performance improvement technique here, the number of mappers. Another performance technique could be this one, right? So if you see in the log, this says this transfer can be faster if you use hyphen direct. So let me give you back. So this is my query. So what we are trying to do is we are trying to connect to this database using a MySQL, using a JDBC connector. Now what it is trying to say, instead of connecting a JDBC director, so you can give another option called hyphen direct. It will basically use the native directories that are available, right? So whatever native directories or native connectors that are available for that particular database, it will use those those drivers, not the third party connectors like the JDBC. That way it will be faster, right? So that's also one of the techniques that you can use. Okay, now what will happen if you don't have a primary key and you're not using a split by, or you are not mentioning the number of mappers, right? So in that case your query is going to fail. So it's going to fail saying that there is no primary key or something like that. So you can try that. You can create a table with no primary key and try to import that without mentioning the split by key, right? So that's it. That's all I wanted to cover in this session, and I'll see you guys in my next class.